This whole topic of faith and science, for some they might think, well, it's passe. This was resolved years ago. The more we understand about science, the clearer it is that faith was a temporary institution. That, in fact, as you learn more about the physical world, it becomes obvious that we really don't need God and that God was mythical, perhaps. And there are a great many people in higher education, in the sciences generally, who believe that. Far more so in Europe than here in America. But if you needed a reminder for how many people believe this fallacy, that the more you understand science, the less you desire faith, then a good reminder would be the photograph that appeared about 2 days back that caught the vice president and the coronavirus task force opening in prayer with their heads bowed. Well, the photo was immediately ridiculed. One commentator said that Pence and his team were, quote, wallowing in ignorant superstition and willful ignorance, unquote. Another commentator stated, it's not a joke when people are trying to stop a virus with prayer. What else did anyone expect? Science? Reason? Something sensible? A little sarcasm there. Well, it's popular to think that science and faith are at opposite ends of the spectrum and somehow mutually exclusive. But the Bible states that science should ultimately lead to faith. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, it says, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. In other words, God's existence, his incredible power, his divine nature, the fact that there is a God, should be obvious from studying his creation. Theologians refer to this as general revelation. God reveals himself through what he has made. Now, some years back, I visited Barcelona, Spain. Great place if you've never been there. It is where you would find the Picasso Museum, a very, very interesting museum. We waited in line a long time to go there, and they had works from all of Picasso's various eras, and quite something. Now, Pablo Picasso's genius was obvious in the incredible works of art that he had created. So you can know much about an artist, and you can know much about a man through the works of his hands, through the things that he's created, through his artwork. Likewise, you can find out a great deal about God through his handiwork, through his creation. Theologians refer to the Bible as special revelation. God speaking through men in words that can be understood, thereby giving far more detail about who God is and his relationship with his creation than you could ever get by just looking at his creation. If I were to read Picasso's letters, I would know much more about Picasso, the man. I would know why he painted this picture or that picture and what he was seeking to depict, what he felt like when he painted them, what his goal was. Well, the Bible is God's letter, actually letters to us, written over almost 1,000 years, 66 books, through 27 different people, but with one voice. And from creation, we can know that God is. From the Bible, we can know who he is, what he's like, and what he expects of us. And all that, God says, is because science, the study of his creation, leads us to him. Whenever anyone speaks about faith or science, it's important to understand what that person's bias is, or the biases that they come to any subject with. But people come to the Bible from multiple vantage points, either believing it is all true, partly true, or not true at all. Well, it is generally presumed that science conflicts with faith. In my own life, I have found just the opposite. Science drew me to faith. I did not come to faith first and then seek to find proof for what I believed. Rather, I was a skeptic who came to faith based on what I discovered. My first inkling that there was some great mind behind the universe was during my senior year in college. I was sitting in a course entitled Electromagnetic Fields and Waves. Okay, strange place to find God. One of the things that we did in that class was model various physical disciplines. And we used analog computers. You may not realize it, but there was a time when a significant percentage of computers were analog and not digital. And with an analog computer, you could model virtually anything that happened in the physical world. And what struck me was this: the formulae in all the various disciplines were identical. So that if you looked at the formula for a shock absorber in your car, it was identical to the formula for an inductor in your radio. And you could take virtually anything that you see in any discipline and find that there are analogs, and the formula are all the same. That struck me as indicating design. I thought, this can't be an accident. There must be a designer. But then I dropped that line of thinking and went back to being just a nice, godless, decent person. Since then, I have arrived at the conviction that the Bible is indeed true and accurate and does not conflict with science. I came to that conclusion after a very lengthy and, I believe, a very thorough investigation. So I'll share just a little bit of my background. Some of you are aware of it already, but I'll share it for those who are not. And a bit about the things that led up to that investigation and a few of the things that I discovered. Now, I'm an engineer. I shared that before. My wife views that as a form of mental dysfunction. Okay, and that's really, engineers think differently. In logical syllogisms, everything has to add up. It's very disquieting if there is something that doesn't add up. And for me, my life went forward as an engineer after college. I graduated. I went to work for IBM, and I was selling their large mainframes, first in systems and then in sales on the large mainframes. Now, large is relative. An entire room of large mainframe equipment had less power than this Apple Watch that I'm wearing. Those were the days when 64K was delivered by truck. Okay, I actually was aware of a sad occurrence at one of my clients. They dropped the 64K on some unsuspecting guy. Okay, now, 64K today you can't even buy, but if you were to buy a few gigs or even a terabyte in a hard drive, you'd hold it in the palm of your hand. I mean, it's a different world. It's a different world. But back then, those were big computers. They called it big iron. I met my wife-to-be while I was there at IBM. And she was an occasional churchgoer. I vacillated between being an atheist and an agnostic. Now, an atheist is somebody who says, there is no God. An agnostic says, well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you can know. I don't know if anybody can know. I don't know if I can know. So, 2 years into our marriage, my wife became a committed Christian. Not part of my life plan. As a matter of fact, I found it very disturbing because now I had a religious fanatic for a wife. But I thought, this will last 6 weeks, 8 weeks, maybe 2 months. It'll be like Tupperware parties. I was very dismissive. And I thought, okay, well, we'll get past this. But after several months of watching her, I realized that she was not going to change. There had been a personality transplant. Same voice, same body. Somebody else was living inside. She should have reacted very differently to things that I did. And yet, that normal volley that goes back and forth in any close relationship, where if I say this, she'll say that, and then I'll say this, and then she'll say that, and that disappeared. And it was driving me crazy, seeing how nice she was. But what I saw was this change that I wanted. I just didn't want it the way that she had it. As an engineer, I know if you build the most beautiful house on a bad foundation, the house will ultimately collapse. And she was building this new life and this faith that she had on the Bible. And as far as I was concerned, it was a collection of fairy tales. I had never read it, but that was my assumption. The only Bible we had as a kid was a big, about 4-inch thick Bible that sat sideways on the bookshelf. And I guess I did know everything that was in it. There were pressed flowers, newspaper clippings. It was basically a closed book. A few times I tried to pick it up and read it, and it made no sense to me. So I had this logical problem, and I had to determine if the Bible was in fact a supernatural book. But how could I, a natural being, really even attempt to judge what is supernatural? And so I thought about it, and I thought, there are some tests I can set up to see if this contains supernatural knowledge. It would have to be knowledge they could not have had when it was written several thousand years ago, but that we have today. So things that we know for certain today, what did they say back then? If it was revealed to them, as it claimed, it should be God's insight. If it was just a bunch of guys sitting around dreaming about what God might say to them and maybe looking for the accolades that would come by being somebody who speaks for God, then it's going to represent the era in which they wrote and the popular beliefs of that time. So, what would those things be? Well, I concluded that would be things such as scientific information, unknown at that time, that we know for certain today. I also looked at historical information related to prophecies, because by then I had come to understand that there were claims that there had been prophecies that had been fulfilled. And I looked at those with the eye of really kind of suspecting it's probably going to be like Gene Dixon and Nostradamus, general statements made that after the fact you could apply almost anything to. But I wanted to see, were these really specific prophecies specifically fulfilled, as if you were reading the newspaper today, which may not be accurate, but that's a different story. But I was looking for that level of accuracy. When I looked at prophecy, I was looking primarily at prophecies related to the Jews and to the Messiah. We're not going to address that to any significant degree today with regards to the prophecies. Today I want to look specifically at science. So I began investigating the Bible, looking specifically for what it had to say with regards to science. And I began reading through Genesis. It's a big book, had to start somewhere, so I started at the beginning. And I found that the creation account, which I expected to have great problems with, was really poetic. It was not scientific. It was not attempting to say this is exactly how God did things. I found some interesting little tidbits. For example, Eve was made from Adam. And it could never have been the other way around, because Eve has 2 X chromosomes. You couldn't get a Y in there. Adam was an X and a Y, so he had all of the genetic material necessary for a woman. She did not have enough for a man. Um, the and I really thought the human race needed to start somewhere, and it would have required a man and a woman. It didn't give me a lot of detail about that, but there was enough. And so I wasn't looking to understand all the theology. I just wanted to see, does this conflict with what's been discovered? Since then, I've realized there is a very important question to ask. Did Adam have a navel? If you think about it, if he did, there was the appearance that he was born. Well, actually, just the fact that he was an adult male, there is the appearance that he was born. And then I've considered, did he make an oak tree or did he make an acorn? If you have an acorn, there's the appearance that it dropped off a tree. If he made a tree, there's the appearance that it started as an acorn. And then you ask the question, did an oak tree have rings? If it had rings, there's the appearance of age. If it didn't have rings, it couldn't have gotten very big because it would have collapsed. Structurally, you need the rings. And it became obvious then that whatever happened had to have happened mid-system. That it wasn't something that started tiny and became other things. It had to start mid-system. And so I thought, well, that's intriguing. Then I found, as I'm reading through Genesis and reading through some of the other books, there's very little about science. And initially I was a little frustrated by that. I was, however, struck by the fact that there were no fanciful scientific absurdities as are found in other ancient literature. If you read the Quran, there is a dome that is the sky that is held up by Allah, and at any day could fall, could collapse. A whole different cosmology. The Bible never speaks about that. Doesn't say such things. And then I was very surprised to find that many major discoveries have been made based on the Bible. So much so that in the High Middle Ages, theology was named the Queen of the Sciences. And that was when schools divided classical liberal arts learning into grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And they said, the Bible, that's the Queen of the Sciences. Theology, the Queen of the Sciences. Men went to the Bible to find out about nature. A great many discoveries were made based on that, even as recently as the 18th and 19th centuries. Matthew Fontaine Maury has a statue dedicated to him at Annapolis, Maryland. And on it, it says, Pathfinder of the seas, his inspiration, Holy Writ, Psalm 8, thou hast made highways in the seas for the fish. Well, let me give you the background. Matthew Fontaine Maury lived in the 1800s. It was a time when clipper ships plied their trade back and forth between England and America. And a major problem that they ran into was running out of wind, no current. They were becalmed. If it was long enough, the people would die. At the very least, the merchants would lose money because these were pecuniary businesses with the expectation of making a profit. And if it took a few days extra or a few weeks extra to cross, the profit might be gone. And of course, the entire shipment might be lost with the crew. And so there were many who thought maybe there is a good way to cross the Atlantic. Maybe there are effectively highways there. Well, Matthew Fontaine Maury was involved in navigation, had traveled back and forth multiple times between the two locations, and he set his mind to this, and then he got sick. And he was quite sick. As a matter of fact, he was dying. His son, Richard, wrote an account of what happened in 1915. He wrote his book, And let me quote from that. At one time, when Commodore Maury was very sick, he asked one of his daughters to get the Bible and read to him. She chose Psalm 8, the 8th verse of which speaks of, quote, whatsoever walketh through the paths of the sea. And then Matthew Maury repeated out loud, the paths of the sea, the paths of the sea. If God says the paths of the sea, they are there. And if I ever get out of this bed, I will find them. And so he prayed and he said, God, if you raise me up, I will spend the rest of my life finding those pathways. Well, he indeed did get well. He began his deep sea soundings as soon as he was strong enough. And he found that 2 ridges extend from the New York coast to England. So he made charts for ships to sail over one path to England and return over the other. His charts are still in use today. I also found, as I went through, little Holy Spirit footnotes. Now you may ask, what is that? Well, they're these little bits of information people could not have had at that time. A Holy Spirit footnote is when God says, P.S., Moses didn't write this, I did. Signed, H.S. Take the number of stars in the universe. At the time the Bible was written, astronomers of that day could count approximately 3,000 stars with the naked eye. The most widely accepted star count was that of Anaximander, a Greek astronomer and a mathematician from Miletus, who was best known as Pythagoras' teacher. In his work about nature, that's the name of his treatise, he counted 3,253 stars with the naked eye. And that was the most widely accepted star count of that day. That's how many stars there are in the skies, in the universe. Hipparchus, Ptolemy, other ancients counted less than 2,000 stars. It may just be that Anaximander had better eyesight, not sure. But that would have been the count you would have expected in the scriptures. Galileo, centuries later, millennia later, with his telescope, was able to increase that to over 30,000 stars. Still far fewer than what you find in the physical world. It's reasonable, therefore, that the Bible, in mentioning the number of the stars, would quote a figure in the thousands. It does not. Instead, it repeats on multiple occasions. Genesis 27:17 for one, quote, the number of the stars is as the sands of the seas, unquote. It should not say that. No other ancient book says that. They all talk about a relatively few number of stars when they touch upon it. Sir James Jeans, a British astronomer, a skeptic, wrote in 1965 in his book, The Stars and Their Courses, quote, there are probably something like as many stars in the universe as there are grains of sand on all the seashores of the world, unquote. An extremely large, uncountable, finite number. The great scientist Louis Pasteur said, quote, science brings men nearer to God, unquote. He discovered that pathogens cause disease. He invented the first vaccine. He invented pasteurization. He was a brilliant, brilliant man, and he started from the premise that this is God's design that we live in. And based on that, he sought for information and knowledge, and he was seeking to unlock God's secrets of design that were hidden in nature. You see, intelligent men do not immediately discount God. Perhaps the greatest genius of our lifetimes and prior lifetimes was a man named Albert Einstein. Einstein said this, quote, I believe in a God who reveals himself in the harmony of all that exists. I am convinced that God does not play dice, unquote. The structure of the universe brought Albert Einstein to faith. In 1979, I attended a little church in Luling, Louisiana, and went to the Sunday school afterwards. It was a relatively small class, and people shared a little bit about their background. And this one elderly woman shared that she had been Albert Einstein's maid for much of her adult life. She was a believer. I asked her about Dr. Einstein's faith. She said he loved the Lord. He was a godly man. Now, that's not going to be repeated in the scientific text, but that quote that I shared with you, people know that is his quote. That was him speaking. Great knowledge, great intellect does not drive people away from God. I had a professor in seminary who said, scratch a skeptic and you'll find a sinner. That people approach it deductively with the conclusion there can't be a God, because if there were a God, he wouldn't be happy with what I'm doing. That's why I vacillated between atheism and agnosticism. Prior to Einstein, Isaac Newton was the greatest analyst of the physical universe. He sought to find the basic laws of physics, he said, because, quote, I search for laws because I am convinced there is a lawgiver. Randomness and time do not produce laws. Only a master intelligence can produce such laws. More recently, Nikola Tesla, thought by many to be the greatest inventor of all time, by the way, although known to many people only by his last name, thinking he invented a car, okay, which he did not. But he firmly believed that God had designed everything in the physical universe. He worked first for Thomas Edison, but then he went off on his own. Edison would test and test and test myriads of different types of filaments to find one that worked well. And so he famously said, Thomas Edison did, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, because that was how he made his discoveries. He was an experimenter, and he just kept experimenting, and then ultimately would find things as he experimented. Tesla approached things very differently. He claimed his discoveries were revelations from God, and he prayed for insights to be revealed to him. A man of great faith, he would wake up in the morning and sketch an invention he had dreamt about the night before. Most only know his name through the automobile, but the reality is virtually everything in our lives today would be different if he had not lived. He invented the alternating current generator, the alternating current motor, and actually the use of alternating current for the distribution of electricity. Now, that may not mean much to you, but Edison used direct current. That would go anywhere from 1 to 3 miles at a max. So that in Edison's mind, people would have generators. And those generators might support a small area of the city, but there would be many, many, many generators. And you could not transmit electricity over long distances. With alternating current, Tesla, with his inventions, including the transformer, he was able to convert his electricity into very, very high voltages and transmit them over very long distances. He and George Westinghouse designed and implemented the great generators at Niagara Falls and distributed that hydroelectric energy throughout the Midwest, in fact, through much of our nation. Our lives will be quite a bit different. This came to him, he claims, through revelation. Incredible. A man of faith, driven to make discoveries that changed our lives even today. Perhaps the most interesting thing he ever worked on was at Wardenclyffe in New York, on Long Island. He had concluded that you could transmit electricity wirelessly. and he built a transmitting station. And he was able to demonstrate lighting light bulbs 25 miles away without wires. In his lab, he had no wires. He would hang light bulbs wherever he wanted light without any connections. He was an incredible guy. You may ask, well, what happened to that? Well, J.P. Morgan funded the distribution of wired electricity. J.P. Morgan was also funding Nikola Tesla. And at some point, he realized that the distribution of electricity wirelessly would destroy his investment, much as cellular has almost eliminated wired telephony. He died in the early years of World War II, and his labs were taken over by the government, and have whatever was there continues to be under lock and key because there was concern the Germans would get that. But a man of faith being driven to scientific discoveries. And so, as I'm going through discovering some of these things, this is so opposite of what I thought the case was and what I had been taught. The great mathematician Blaise Pascal wrote in his book Pensees, "What else does this craving, this helplessness proclaim but that there was once in man a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace. This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help he cannot find in those that are, though none can help, since this infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object, in other words, by God himself." You may have heard that expressed as there is a God-shaped vacuum within each one of us. Blaise Pascal, brilliant mathematician, believed in God. I was impressed at what the Bible doesn't say in other ways. Unlike other ancient texts, the Bible does not state that the earth is flat. Instead, it indicates that the roundness or sphere of the earth is hung upon nothing. The Hebrew word used to describe the form of the earth is quok, which is also the word for ball. It can be seen in two places. Isaiah 40, verses 21 to 22. "Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the earth was founded? God sits enthroned above the circle of the earth." The word there is quok. The roundness, the sphericity, the ball of the earth. And its people are like grasshoppers. In Job 26:7, he spreads out the northern skies over empty space. He suspends the earth over nothing. Now, the first time I read through that, I didn't pick it up. He suspends the earth over nothing. Ancient peoples believed Atlas held it up. It was on the back of a turtle, on the back of an elephant, a huge elephant, any number of different crazy things. You don't read that in the Bible. Suspended upon nothing. Until we sent a satellite up, we only theorized that the earth was suspended on nothing. Or you look at the moon. The Chinese thought a dragon ate the moon every month. James 1:17 speaks of shifting shadows on the moon. Well, since my initial study, I've spent a good deal of time fascinated by DNA and the human genome. We'll look at this more in depth in a future message, but let me share a few items now. The structure of DNA is incredible. The efficiency of it as a storage medium. In every cell of your body, there is a massive amount of data stored. It indicates what color your eyes are going to be. The little blue flecks in your green eyes or your brown eyes, the color of your hair, any number of different things, the length of your fingers. It's unbelievable, the level of precision and how much data is stored there. Well, it turns out that the structure of DNA is far and away the most efficient storage medium in the world. A bioengineer and geneticist at Harvard Swiss Institute has successfully stored 5.5 petabits of data, that's around 700 terabytes, in a single gram of DNA. Scientists have been eyeing up DNA as a potential storage medium for a long time for three very good reasons. It's incredibly dense. You can store 1 bit per base, and really in 1 or 2 atoms you can store a bit. It's incredibly dense. It's about as dense as you can make it. It is incredibly stable. Where other bleeding edge storage mediums need to be kept in sub-zero vacuums, DNA can survive for hundreds of thousands of years in a box in your garage. Now somebody would say, oh, that just happened by accident. Well, I had an opportunity to meet with one of the fellows at IBM. Brilliant woman, who there's specific individuals who are unique at IBM, and they wind up being designated as fellows. And she was one. And I was talking with her about this, and I said, have you thought about using DNA as a design for storage medium? And she said, yes. She said, as a matter of fact, we've had a project ongoing for some years to do that. And she said, the level of density is unbelievable. She said, our biggest problem is it takes us too long to retrieve data. They don't know how to retrieve the data because that is not as obvious as the structure of DNA. And yet in your cells, the data is retrieved instantaneously. Some small change happens in one place in your body, and in an almost infinitely short amount of time, it is distributed through your whole body. The communication is phenomenal. So think of this. Some scientists who believe everything was an accident are reverse engineering DNA to figure out how to store data efficiently. 1,000,000 times more densely packaged than anything man has yet designed, and yet they are believing that DNA is the ultimate result of an explosion in eons past. Would you spend time investigating the fruits of an explosion to determine the order that exists within it and conclude it is the best ordered of anything in the history of the universe? I suspect not. Explosions do not produce order. In fact, DNA is also a programming language. Now, my background as an adult has spent a great deal of time working with software. And I'm familiar with many different programming languages: COBOL, Fortran, C++, C#. I mean, any number of different programming languages. And they're nothing compared to the elegance and efficiency of DNA. There's an incredible amount of information in your cells, made basically with just 4 amino acids placed in different orders. The information in your cells is so substantial that if you were to print out the DNA in one cell, print out your genome, if you will, on 8.5 by 11-inch paper, just standard 20-pound weight, it would be a stack as high as the Washington Monument. Science doesn't destroy faith. Science leads us to faith. Now, that level of information doesn't happen by accident. We have no other explanation in human experience for information coming into being except there was a mind that created the information. We're not looking at rocks and mountains and even trees. We're looking now at a significant amount of information. Consider if you had a few hundred monkeys on a desert island and they spelled out with stone HELP, and a plane flying overhead saw it. They couldn't understand it if they didn't speak English. There needs to be a translation of all that information. How does that happen? In my experience, in fact, in everyone's experience, The only way that a programming language is read is it runs on a computer, and there is another program that translates it. It doesn't have information that can be transmitted in itself. There has to be some other key. There has to be something to determine what is the meaning of this. But a little cell in his or her mother's womb self-translates itself. It interprets itself. It builds itself. There's no computer. It's within the DNA. So beyond being a programming language, it contains everything necessary to translate and compute. But it happened by accident. Science leads you to conclude there had to be a mind. And that mind is so far beyond ours. And our best quest is to seek to understand that mind. Well, that mind is God. When I looked at the design, and I didn't know some of these things about DNA at that point, I knew a little bit about it, I had to conclude there was a designer. And when I tested the Bible, I found that it was incredibly accurate and contained information that, in fact, was unknown 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. When I looked at the prophecies were incredibly precise. When I looked at the science, my mind was boggled. I couldn't believe it. I had made a presumption that was so different and opposite that those who trusted the Bible were fools, that you pretty much had to take the top of your head out, remove your brain, set it aside, and then move forward. And I realized I was the idiot, that I had closed my mind to something that was there right in front of me the whole time. The scientific mind says, seeing is believing. But there are many things that are invisible that are nonetheless real. In your pocket, you have something that says loudly that you believe in the invisible. You have a cell phone. You take the invisible for granted. To say there is a God you cannot see is no more questionable than to say that there are radio waves passing through this room and to your phone that you cannot see. You believe in atoms and protons and neutrons and quarks and electrons because somebody told you they existed. Yet they are invisible, and you've never seen them unless you have had special equipment to detect them, not even see them. You believe that the speed of light is the maximum velocity of anything. Yet scientists in Princeton, New Jersey, almost 20 years ago, were able to discover that shining a beam of light through cesium, the light began to leave before it had even finished entering. It exceeded significantly the speed of light. We make assumptions. When you begin examining the raw data of the scriptures, it's amazing to see there is a God. He has designed this. In Psalm 19, verses 1 through 4, we read, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. They have no speech, they use no words, no sound is heard from them, and yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world." Thank you very much.